The gospel parable that we have this weekend is basically about how to respond with an RSVP. A king was giving a wedding banquet for his son, and apparently it was quite a lavish affair. It seems the people had been invited and had promised they would come. They responded to the RSVP positively. But now the king has the banquet prepared and sends out his servants to tell people everything is ready, and they renege on their promise to come. Some of them go to a farm, some go to a business, some do other things. They had other priorities other than coming to the banquet like they had said they would. I don't know if you have ever thought about it, but that is somewhat the pattern for the history of salvation. In the beginning, God created the world and Adam and Eve, and He gave them not a banquet, but the Garden of Eden, and invited them to enjoy it. All they had to do was follow the rules, but they had other priorities. Later, from all the nations, God selected the Hebrews to be the chosen people. He would be their God, they would be His people. He would lead them to the promised land, a land flowing with milk and honey, and all would be well if they kept the covenant. But they had other priorities. Still later, when Jesus came, He is speaking to the Jewish leaders in the parable today. And He's saying that they are responsible for reestablishing the kingdom of Israel. God's promise was still in existence, that the covenant would be fulfilled, it would not die out. God's promises to the chosen people would be kept. But the religious leaders that Jesus spoke to had other priorities. As I mentioned last week, when Jesus spoke the parable last week and the parable this week, it was in the last week of His life, the week before He was crucified and died. And He is confronting the religious leaders for the last time. They have failed their people. They have not reestablished the kingdom of Israel as God wanted. They had other priorities. But then Matthew, 55 years after the death of Christ, when he wrote his gospel, he included this parable from among all the parables and sayings and actions of Jesus. He included this one for us and for all the people who will follow us in reading that gospel. God has invited us to a heavenly banquet also. At baptism, we promised that we would show up, that we would reject sin and evil, that we would live as faithful children of God. And each Easter, we renew those baptismal promises. God has planned a great future for us. And Isaiah's prophecy today is an invitation for us to look toward our eternal destiny. There's more to live for than what we see in this present world. And what really is important is whether we are successful in reaching our goal of eternal happiness with God or not. Maybe the image of a splendid banquet isn't so attractive to us. We certainly, in reality, don't expect to sit down in heaven at some everlasting meal. And every time and every culture will picture heaven according to their own standards, according to what's going on in their own life at that time. And at the time of Jesus, when He spoke the parable, the widespread poverty, the enduring hunger for the people, it made a banquet seem really wonderful. But we also remember that St. Paul said, "Eye has not seen, nor can the human heart imagine what God has prepared for those who love him. It's going to be better than a banquet. However we picture our ultimate goal, the real challenge and test for us is our personal commitment to getting to that banquet, to realizing the fulfillment of our dreams, the fulfillment of God's promises. God prepares the best for us, and he offers us the fullness of life and happiness. But we have to want it. We have to work to make it happen. That's probably the meaning of that troublesome image in the parable, the man without a wedding garment. We can ask, how can some poor man who gets invited off the street, how can he have a wedding garment? Some commentators on the gospel propose that the king would know that, and so probably when he invited the poor people from the streets, he provided them some garments to wear. And the man just had to take it and use it, but he didn't. But then, whatever the answer to that problem is, we don't really know. At least he could have done what everybody else did. All the other people gathered in off the street were poor like him, and they were welcomed. They did the right thing. At least he could have done what they did. Our baptism most definitely put us on the guest list for those that Jesus invited to come to heaven with him. And every Sunday we confirm our acceptance of the invitation with our profession of faith, the creed. But despite that, the choices that we make, our priorities, might still keep us from getting to the wedding feast. It's easy to think of heaven as the better choice of the options we are offered when we die. But in reality, that offer of heaven is made here and now. We make our choice to accept God's invitation or not right now as we're living. We make that choice day by day. And death only makes our choice final. It can't be changed then. We are already making our response to God's invitation by the priorities that we choose here day by day. In the parable today, we are told that those who were invited by the king were simply not interested. They were too involved with other things, with other worldly interests. But what about us? Are we closed to the invitations from God? Are we so caught up in all of our concerns and all of our interests and other things in this life that we really don't pay attention to God's invitation? That's the challenge for us. God is offering us so much, a heavenly reward, however we see it, as a banquet or something else. But we have to respond. We have to put on Christ, as St. Paul says in another place. We have to put on Christ, just as the man in the gospel had to put on that wedding garment.